This is a comment that just appeared. It says, why coalitions of wealthy nations should fund others to decarbonize. So if we think of decarbonization as, you know, something like mitigation, but much further in terms of just making the system independent of carbon, we've discussed decarbonization elsewhere. There is this whole debate about loss and damage, which I have also discussed, which is about paying poor countries when they get hit by climate disasters, and some of the damages are beyond their ability in terms of recovering and adapting to future disasters and so on. The idea is that historically responsible wealthy nations, especially the West, Europe, North America, Australia, Russia is also there, should pay for, you know, loss and damage created, you know, caused by climate change. But maybe this is different because decarbonization will help everybody. When climate disasters hit somewhere far away, maybe wealthy nations don't feel so connected to that. They should, but obviously they don't. But what about decarbonization as a way of just getting a better life for themselves? And decarbonizing in one place doesn't make much sense because it will add to reducing total CO2 emission, which will reduce warming. But imagine decarbonizing the entire system across the globe. So let's see what the logic is, because this says they should fund others to decarbonize, so they will offer some logic for that. We are looking here at a coal-fired power plant in Komati, South Africa, which was decommissioned in 2022 as part of the country's plans to phase out fossil fuels, which means you emit CO2 anywhere in the world, it's going to be part of the overall CO2 budget because it's well mixed, long lasting, and it's going to cause global warming, right? So failure to agree on global grants to help low and middle income countries to achieve net zero emissions cannot be the end of the story. An urgent solution is needed, right? So we have been negotiating so many things, and there's been a paradigm that maybe decarbonizing is much better than trying to reduce emissions. In Baku last November, parties to the COP29 United Nations Climate Summit failed to put in place enough climate finance to keep global average warming below 1.5 degrees C limit established in the 2015 Paris Agreement. Actually, Paris Agreement agreed to 2 degrees C, and then Alliance of Small Island and Developing States pushed it down to 1.5 degrees C. High-income countries agreed, HICs, only to take the lead in directing at least $300 billion to low and middle-income countries, LMICs, each year by 2035. Their own contributions were left unspecified and could be drawn from a variety of sources. Meanwhile, the Baku Agreement calls on all actors to scale up this total financing to at least 1.3 trillion annually. You know, that's more than 4 times the 300 billion. Although these headline numbers seem to be broadly similar to those that were proposed by climate finance experts, including some of the authors before the COP29 meeting, in reality, this fudged, scattershot approaches falls far short of what's needed in terms of timing and quality. Ideally, climate finance should be given in the form of public grants or equivalents. That way recipients don't need to find money elsewhere to repay the loans, and the finance can be used as a catalytic capital to attract private finance that can be co-invested in renewables for lower and middle income countries, LMICs. Grants can also be spent on ending the use of fossil fuels early. The broad mix of public and private, bilateral and multilateral sources allowed by COP29 is inefficient. To decarbonize the world in time, climate finance should be provided at full scale this year, which is 2025, instead of being delayed to 2035, specialists say. Another big stumbling block in Baku was the requirement for unanimity among the parties for agreements. For example, the Arab group of negotiators refused to accept any text that targeted specific sectors, including fossil fuels, even though these are the main source of emissions that climate finance is intended to abate. You know why Arab groups will balk at fossil fuel sector. Without access to climate finance at scale, LMICs cannot afford to decarbonize, and the time is running out. To have even a 50% chance of holding to the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degrees C limit, the world has a remaining budget of only around 180 gigatons of carbon dioxide, which comes from the idea that the cumulative carbon CO2 is linearly proportional to the warming. So if we want to keep at 1.5, you know how much carbon cumulatively we can emit. We know how much we have already emitted, and we know how much we are emitting per year, and so on. So we can estimate how much more we can emit to stay within 1.5 with this linear relation. This is projected to be depleted by 2035, assuming a linear rate of decline starting from the estimated annual emissions of about 40 gigatons in 2025, or as soon as 2029, assuming current emissions levels continue. So you can play around with these numbers, but basically we are not reducing emissions right now. We are still increasing CO2 and other greenhouse gases. Exceeding this limit makes crossing planetary tipping points more likely, including collapses of ice sheets, ocean currents, coral reefs, and permafrost, threatening the lives and livelihoods of billions of people. Generally, I'm not a big fan of tipping point concept because we are unsure of what it means. Collapses of ice sheets, which ones? The little one in Switzerland that collapsed, there are many that are retreating and so on, but collapse is often something that we are not good at predicting. But any warming is bad news in any case, so we must continue to mitigate. And having these kind of deadlines, does it help to bring about action? Obviously hasn't worked so far. Immediate action is needed to phase out and replace fossil fuels, as well as to scale up CO2 removal technologies and protect and restore carbon uptake in nature. All good words, but CCS, carbon capture, is not going so great in terms of scaling up to gigaton levels. If these measures are conducted simultaneously and at scale to reach net zero emissions by 2050 and negative emissions thereafter, only then can global warming be limited to a 1.5 degrees C increase or remain close to it. This year offers a unique chance to act because the countries are required to update their declared national emissions reductions contributions to the Paris Agreement during 2025. That's again revisions of what already have been submitted. It's updating the declared national NDCs. Here we call on nations to find an immediate solution, taking inspiration from the idea of climate clubs, agreements among economically self-interested nations to cut emissions through aligned policies. We propose that coalitions of willing high-income countries form climate finance clubs in their own self-interests. These clubs could finance decarbonization in LMICs, sidestepping the need for a global agreement, which inevitably results in a watered-down deal. So, idea of clubs is that these are prestigious entities that everybody wants to join, and hence they will adhere to the agreed-upon rules and regulations on reducing their emissions and so on. So, will that work? Well, maybe. Benefits for all. Why should countries want to pay others to act? It's in their own economic interests to reduce global emissions quickly and form the planet's perspective. It doesn't matter whether these emissions are emitted domestically or elsewhere, right? No matter where it's emitted, especially carbon is going to be part of the warming system. For instance, in the past 6 months, climate-related damages from hurricanes Helen and Milton in the United States, floods in Valencia in Spain, and wildfires in LA, California are estimated to exceed 500 billion. That's already more than the annual level of climate finance that HICs currently provide, around 100 billion a year, and more than they pledged at COP29 for 2035, which is at 300 billion. Such costs will only escalate until global emissions are curbed, so can argue that you benefit directly as well by decarbonizing others. Groups of HICs must put in place the beginnings of a climate finance framework for LMICs this year. They should offer such countries grants that complement, not offset, their own rapid decarbonization efforts. So you need to add to their effort of LMICs in decarbonizing. Loans are always tricky because many of these countries are already in debt. To avoid expensive and socially unacceptable climate impacts, the only thing that matters is that emissions are reduced extremely fast globally. To be most effective, investments should be given with the highest priority to LMICs that commit in their 2025 Paris update to credible emissions reductions, those that are consistent with keeping the world within 1.5 degrees C of pre-industrial average temperatures. Such countries can make bolder decarbonization pledges that are conditional on receiving climate finance. As recipients decarbonize their economies, they also benefit from lower exposure to domestic climate damages and air pollution, which in turn reduce their adaptation needs, okay, which means their finance needs as well. There are already coalitions of HICs willing to provide climate finance, even if the United States does not participate, and right now that is looking almost guaranteed that the US is pulling out of agreements, deconstructing its own climate action plans, renewable deployments, and so on. For example, the European Union, along with with other HICs and multilateral development banks, have offered climate finance through Just Energy Transition Partnerships, or JETPs, to Indonesia at $20 billion, Vietnam at $15 billion, of which half was from private sources. Offers were also made to South Africa at $8.5 billion and Senegal at $2.7 billion. Such deals can be expanded to other LMICs, especially ones that are large emitters, including Colombia, Kazakhstan, Nigeria, Mexico, Thailand, and India, which together would quickly add up to a significant proportion of avoided emissions. But adjustments are needed to avoid shortcomings. So here is the benefits of a climate finance club. By offering a US $1.4 trillion pool of grants to help low and middle income countries switch away from fossil fuels, a finance club of high income nations can help returns of up to 500% and limit climate damages. So this number, 500% return, has a lot of details in it and assumptions, and if rich countries are not convinced, then obviously they're not going to buy it, because if it was obvious, they would have jumped on it already. World finance pull-in: if governments put in 0.3% of GDP, around 124 billion a year during 2025 to 35, private firms might offer 3 times more. So here costs in US trillion dollars, public and private partnerships 1.4 and 3.7 can together add up to 5.1 trillion dollars. Some magic, but if it happens, it'll be pretty stunning. In terms of avoided losses, by investing now, nations can save trillions of dollars by 2035 by preventing future damages. Social cost of carbon assumed is low or high in these cases, so overall benefits can be low if social cost of carbon is assumed low. So net benefits are almost zero at $0.1 trillion if you assume a low social cost of carbon is basically damage created by each ton of carbon that you add to the atmosphere or to the Earth system. And if you assume a high social cost of carbon, then the net benefits jump to 6.9 trillion and overall benefits jump to 8.3 trillion. You can go and read on the details of how these were done, but essentially this is also ignoring something called discount rate. If you have a chance of achieving benefits in the future and you have to invest upfront, there is something called a discount rate. It's the rate at which a dollar today begins to depreciate immediately. So in the future, it will have less and less value. If you assume a low discount rate, you will have lesser depreciation of your dollar invested today. If you assume a high discount rate, then the dollar will disappear very quickly in terms of benefits of the invested dollar now, right? So far, JETPs have offered mainly loans instead of grants. And if you don't know what JETP is, it's again just energy transition partnerships. In Indonesia, for example, only 2% of JETP funds were grants, yet loans add to LMIC's debts and don't provide capital to catalyze private sector investments to renewables or give incentives for closing fossil fuel infrastructures early. Plans to phase out coal in South Africa, for example, have stalled without sufficient grants and a clear strategy, raising concerns over energy security as well as slowing the transition. So if there are ups and downs in oil supplies, gas supplies, and so on, and South Africa is, like China and India wants to grow, and it should grow economically, then it's going to burn coal if that's the only thing available. The Climate Finance Club needs to do things differently. First, it should offer large sums of JETPs now. First, it should offer larger sums than JETPs do now. It should give all the public funding in grant equivalent form and not loans, and make receipt conditional on a credible implementation plan and on accountability of fossil fuel phase out and renewables phase in. And the idea is that anybody that reduces emissions is going to also reduce your social cost of carbon and damages and global warming impacts on GDPs and so on, right? Returning to the returns on these investments, to illustrate how Climate Finance Club might work, focusing on phasing out and replacing fossil fuels, we have examined the economic case for a group of nations that have the financial capacity and the incentive to support LMIC decarbonization. The group excludes the United States but includes the other G7 countries as well as the European Union, Norway, Switzerland, Australia, and South Korea. We also excluded China and high-income Gulf states as recipients, given their ability to finance their own transition. This reduced climate finance needs to about 500 billion per year from several trillion. Using simple economic methods, we estimate that decarbonization in LMICs consistent with a 1.5 degree C aligned net zero pathway would require climate grants from this HIC coalition that adds up to 124.3 billion per year dollars during 2025 to 35. This amount is equivalent to 0.3% of the annual gross domestic product of the coalition members over that period. It's always critical to look at a percentage of the GDP, because 124.3 billion per year may look like a huge number, but if it's only 0.3% of the GDP, then it looks like completely affordable, right? We find the returns to the HIC coalition on this investment to be between about 9% and potentially more than 500%, depending on the assumed value of the social cost of carbon. This is the cost to society in terms of damages of emitting 1 ton of CO2, ranging from around 190 per ton, an estimate used by the administration of former US President Joe Biden, based on a 2022 study, to $1,056 per ton, a figure broadly in line with a 2024 analysis. So depending on which details you use, the social cost of carbon can be an order of magnitude different, which is scary, right? The higher estimate reflects the use of global rather than country level temperature variability, which correlates better with extreme climatic events. So then you are relating social cost of carbon at a global scale, saying everybody has to pay for the emissions in terms of extremes, increasing extremes. Of course, the distribution of extremes is very, very unpredictable. It's easier to predict global warming temperatures given the increases in emissions, but the patterns of warming and the extreme distribution is quite difficult. Practical challenges then, lots of details remain to be worked out. For instance, in practice, some countries will not submit credible Paris-aligned plans, meaning that the coalition would end up funding individual countries. To avoid discrepancies between the submitted plans and the actual policy action, disbursement of funds should be linked to concrete milestones achieved by LMIC, with the next period's payment tied to the previous period's avoided emissions. Obvious monitoring, reporting, verification. We see the biggest challenge is as getting commitments of public climate finance at the necessary scale Multilateral development banks are the natural intermediaries for these funds, but would themselves require increased funding for this role because they get uh, capital from member countries. They would also need to shift their business models away from loan-based lending to grant-based finance and from project-based to system-wide finance to fund the energy transition for entire countries. Next steps then, looking here at a cute solar panel set up in Indonesia. The nation will receive Indonesia 20 billion US dollars to decarbonize over the next few years under a Just Energy Transition Partnership grant, I think. Next steps. This year's update of nations' contributions to the Paris Agreement presents the next best opportunity to steer global decarbonization pathways towards the 1.5 degree C limit. Accordingly, LMIC should submit credible decarbonization plans that are contingent on receiving climate finance, and coalitions of HICs must step up forwards to provide the funding. Climate finance must be at the top of the agenda of key multilateral gatherings. These include the forthcoming meetings of the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action, the Constitution for the Road to Belém stock take, ahead of the COP30 climate meeting in Brazil in November, and the joint spring meetings of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, and of course the G7 summit in Canada coming up this month in June 2025. Climate finance is essential if the world is to decarbonize. It's not a foreign aid, it's a high return investment in global economic stability and climate security for the benefit of all, including the high income countries themselves. So sounds, compelling, convincing, but when countries make decisions, they have many factors, and this magic numbers on the returns on these investments is not that easily bought by the rich countries. But let's see if this idea takes off at some level, at least in terms of negotiations at the COP30 coming up. Okay, see you in the next topic.